So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this labor of love, and this really important work that helps us understand cardiovascular disease a little bit more. I did this analysis during my BDC Fellowship where I looked at the relationship, the mechanistic relationship between discrimination and cardiovascular disease risk for different groups of individuals. So, why is cardiovascular disease risk such an important health outcome that we really need to focus on? So, first off, we know that it's the leading cause of death in the United States among everyone. We know that there are some very important risk factors that have a lot of science behind them, including smoking, high cholesterol, and high blood pressure. Also, other risk factors include diabetes, weight, physical activity, and alcohol use. In addition, we understand that there are differences in the rates of cardiovascular disease when we look at the intersection of race and gender. So, for example, Hispanic women tend to have less cardiovascular disease than white women, for example, even though they have higher rates of diabetes, for example. So, why do we kind of see these disparities? But first, we need to understand that social determinants of health are critically important in helping us understand cardiovascular disease. So, the American Heart Association came out with this scientific statement in 2015. And since then, there has been a plethora of research and additional statements that really hone in that we must understand social determinants if we're going to address and understand cardiovascular disease. And specifically in my work, I focus on race and ethnicity as the social determinants of health. And because this is a social construction, a lot of my work is associated with discrimination. We know that race stands for racism when we're talking about social determinants of health because it's a social construction overall. And so, how do I understand conceptually how race, racism, and the enactment of race and racism, which is discrimination, is associated with cardiovascular disease? My esteemed colleague, Dr. Tanae Lewis, came up with this beautiful conceptual model in 2019, really portraying and outlining the mechanistic way in which historical and sociopolitical context kind of shapes the ways in which experiences of racism are associated with cardiovascular disease. So a lot of my work has incorporated testing various pathways in this model. And specifically for our discussion today, I'll look at how discrimination is associated with cardiovascular disease risk in the using the proxy measures of carotid intermediate thickness and plaque buildup through smoking behavior. And there's a lot of reasons for this decision, but we know that there is a strong correlation between smoking behavior and cardiovascular disease. And so trying to understand that pathway is really important and can really help us understand how these social determinants are associated with cardiovascular disease. But we also need to think more critically about the role of intersectionality. As I started with in my background, I started by saying that, there are these differences in cardiovascular disease risk depending on, what intersection of race and gender you happen to be at. And so intersectionality theory really helps us think more critically about how the social context and systems of power and privilege kind of shape the ways in which we view and understand social determinants, and then the ways in which those are kind of associated with health outcomes. So we're all on the same page. Intersectionality describes how group memberships are intertwined and influenced by these overarching systems of power and oppression. And it really focuses on how these power relations are distributed among and between these systems of racism, sexism, and their intersection. So for example, how does an intersecting system of racism and sexism kind of influence the ways in which social determinants are perceived and understood by Black women versus white women versus Hispanic women? And then what is that impact on health? So what I really want to kind of bring home is that identities are inextricably linked and reflexive of these larger social power dynamics. And this research is guided by this intersectional framework, and it aims to identify and expand upon disparity research particularly in cardiovascular disease. So in terms of this particular paper that I'll be talking about today, we're really looking at intermediate thickness and plaque buildup. So intermediate is really kind of like how thick these arteries get, and plaque buildup is the actual plaque in the carotid arteries. And we know that this is highly associated with cardiovascular disease. And based on the theoretical model that I showed you in the last slide, we know that, expectations of racism have been shown to be associated with carotid intermediate thickness among Black women specifically. We've also seen research showing that discrimination is associated with CIMT and carotid plaque, but we also see research that's showing that there may not, in fact, be this relationship. So the research literature is pretty mixed, and we hope that using a mechanistic framework like the one I'll present will help clarify some of these questions. So I have a few hypotheses. So my first hypothesis is that everyday discrimination will be associated with higher mean CIMT overall, that smoking status will mediate this relationship, and that race will moderate and mediate the association. So this is what we call a moderated mediation analysis, where we can kind of model both the moderator, which also serves as a mediator in the same statistical model. So as you see in the diagram right here, we see that race moderates the association between everyday discrimination, CVD risk. It also moderates the relationship between everyday discrimination, cigarette use, and the other pathway from cigarette use to CVD risk in our overall mediation model. So, just to say a little bit about the study, this is MESA data. This is the data that I analyzed using the BDC ecosystem during my fellowship. The average age of the sample is older, so the average age of both females and males is 61 years old. We see a variety in the breakdown of race and ethnicity. So, for example, we see that it's majority white among males and females, but we do have, more Chinese American, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans than I saw in a lot of other data sets specifically associated with cardiovascular disease risk. So we have a nice distribution there. We see also that we have most people never smoked in the sample. But in terms of women, we see this all the time in cardiovascular disease risk research. We see that a lot of males were former smokers. So all of these demographics kind of align with a lot of the current CVD research in the field. So in terms of the results, I'm going to walk through kind of the results, and then if there's questions about clarifications, I can come back. So we did a moderated mediation analysis, and we looked at our two outcomes. Our two CVD risk outcomes were CIMT and plaque. So I'm going to talk about the results for CIMT first, and then I'll talk about the results for plaque. And so in terms of CIMT and females, our hypotheses were not supported. We actually didn't find any mediation when we looked specifically at females and specifically among the different racial ethnic groups in the female sample. In terms of males, however, we did find some interesting results that lead to us saying that our results were partially mediated. And so we saw that more discrimination was associated with more smoking for males overall. And then actually among the Hispanic male group only, we saw that cigarette smoke mediated the relationship between discrimination and CIMT, but we did not find this result for the other ethnic racial groups. In terms of plaque, our results were a little bit more nuanced and what I think is interesting. And our results were partially supported for females. So again, we saw, like for males, we saw that experiencing more discrimination was associated with more smoking for females overall. And then we found this interesting finding around the mediation for Hispanic females only. So we found that more discrimination for Hispanic females was indirectly associated through smoking behavior, more plaque buildup. But it was only among the Hispanic women, none of the other racial ethnic categories. And then in terms of plaque buildup, again, for Hispanic males, we found this indirect effect when we looked at plaque as an outcome. But we did not find it for any other racial ethnic group. So, we found these major differences between CVD risk outcomes that should be explored further. We found that our strongest results were really among the Hispanic population, but in comparison to the other racial ethnic groups, we found that, the indirect effects were strongest among the Hispanic males and females separately. Findings suggest that Hispanic males may be using cigarette smoking as a mechanism to cope with discrimination. This is just based on the exact research literature that looks at smoking behavior as a coping mechanism for discrimination, as well as conceptual models in the discrimination and social determinants of health literature. And this is why through this mechanism, we might see an increased CIMT and carotid plaque compared to white males. But why don't we see the same results for other racial ethnic groups? So it may be that racial and ethnic minority women and men become habituated to the effects of experiences of perceived discrimination over time. Skin deep resilience, for example. We are doing a lot of work in the field of discrimination as a social determinants of health to understand, the desensitization hypothesis or the habituation hypothesis, and to understand, is it just something that when we ask in terms of self-report, we're not seeing these findings, or there's actual consequences for our bodies. So in terms of cardiovascular disease, in terms of our health behaviors that are associated with cardiovascular disease. So these are things that need to be explored a little bit deeper. So, examining cardiovascular risk across varying racial ethnic groups of women include understanding differences in the cultural experiences of women of different races and ethnicity that may differentially influence the ways in which they internalize, perceive, and cope with discrimination events. So this paper was a primer paper to basically say that we need to look a little bit closer at individual experiences for those that live at these intersections. There might be cultural realities or just lived experience realities that we really need to focus on in terms of intervention prevention if we want to increase cardiovascular health and decrease cardiovascular disease in real ways. There may also be these key differences in the appraisal of discrimination among men of varying racial ethnic groups, depending on the severity and type of discrimination experience. So there's a lot of work in psychology on kind of the appraisal of a discrimination event and how that immediately leads to some kind of coping experience or some kind of behavior. And so we need to think a little bit more critically in the cardiovascular and SDOH world, or social determinants of health world, about what that appraisal really looks like and how that appraisal specifically is associated with these behaviors like smoking or alcohol use that might be associated with increased cardiovascular disease risk, especially in the context of varying social conditions based on the intersection of race and gender. So I guess in summary, I'll say that there's a need for clinical scientists to examine within-person differences in discrimination and cardiovascular disease risk. That's why I really, really thank my mentorship team for during BDC. My mentorship team and myself worked hard on this paper, and it included clinicians, biostatisticians, epidemiologists, and we all kind of agree that even clinical scientists, we all need to kind of work together to understand these within-person differences. Also, there's these new pathways for prevention interventions that are yet to be identified because we're not using different statistical approaches, but different conceptualizations such as intersectionality to understand where we can intervene and within which communities. So I posit that next steps include using an intersectional approach that combines social context and individual behaviors to elucidate the complex associations between intersectional discrimination and CVD risk. And, I've been fortunate enough to be awarded 2 new R01s to actually, look at this exact question. And I just really believe that we should come together as a community to really dive a little bit deeper and to stretch the science and to contribute to policy changes and prevention interventions that are really tailored to reduce cardiovascular disease risk. So with that, these are my co-authors, my mentors, James Stein and Robin McClellan, and my students, Erica, Sandy, and Lanfei. And this is my lab website. And thank you so much. So I'll take questions now. And I think I saw the icon, so I can now put on my camera.
There you are. I want to keep this slide up while we wait for some people who might be typing some questions in. I do have a couple of questions for you that were handed to me to be asked by people who will be watching this on video. So I want to go ahead and ask those. One of the first was a simple question, but maybe not a simple answer, which is, what are the challenges in looking at intersectionality from this perspective in terms of the data that you're looking at, like matching up different kinds of data so that the work, but also preparing for publication?
Yeah. So I call this my labor of love because, we started in COVID. I was a BDC a fellow during COVID, and I think at that time there was just not a lot of data that was rich enough and had enough intersections to look at complex questions in terms of big data. And I know during my time as a BDC fellow, we talked a lot about data harmonization and the need for data harmonization. And so I think that there are a lot of people working on that. And I think that helps with just basic questions of, do you have enough people in different groups to look at different intersections? That's first. Number two, after, my Pride Fellowship and after BDC, I became an All of Us ambassador, and I started working with the All of Us data, which their entire framework is about making them visible, which is my tagline. So they have a lot more data and you can identify a lot more intersections. So to wrap that up in a better bow, there's 2 things. I think that, us statisticians need to partner with clinicians and epidemiologists to do a better job at harmonizing data across these various national data sets. And then teaching people how to use it and making it more accessible to different communities. And then number 2, I think that having, 1 million Americans in a data set and oversampling for specific under populations who usually don't participate in research are 2 very great ways of being able to have the data sources to ask the questions. And that's why, I call this my primer paper, because, I just looked at two intersections, and I just wanted to basically describe what we may need to do in the future so that all of us collectively can think about how to do that in the future using this intersectional perspective. So I hope that that was
Thank you.
clear.
That was a great answer. I do have a couple of questions for you.
Mhm.
So the first one I have, and I'm just going to read them to you because they came
Okay.
through the Q&A. So the first one is, can you talk a little bit about analyzing the data in the BDC ecosystem? And also, do you suggest exploring this and suggested future research questions using other nationally represented survey data? So those are two different questions. One is about the BDC ecosystem, and the other question was, it's in the chat if you want to look at it, but it says, do you
I got
suggest
it.
exploring this?
Yeah. So yeah, so BDC, we were like, I don't know if I would call ourselves like the first user. I think I was like in the second cohort. And so uh BDC is constantly infusing data. And so when I started, the clinical data for MESA was infused, but the social determinants of health data wasn't infused. So I ran this analysis twice. I got permission to run it off of the outside of BDC, and then I ran it again in BDC. So now the data is available in BDC and you can run it. So I honestly think for any of these virtual data warehouses, I don't understand how non-statisticians actually ramp up. I needed a fellowship to ramp up, and I am a statistician. And I think that the learning curve was really steep. But I will say, once you learn, you're good. It's wonderful. It's the most wonderful thing to be able to analyze publicly available or private data that is infused into this platform on an online platform, and then also be able to collaborate with your peers using the platform. So that was my experience, but remember, this was 4 years ago, so there's probably lots of updates since then. Um, and I know that on study section are seeing a lot more grants proposing to use BDC. And there's just a lot more data infused onto the system. So I the second question, I think that all of us is a really great data source. Again, it's just the learning curve is just as steep as BDC. Um, it has EHR data for some people, or electronic health record data that goes back to like 1997 for some people. So all of these kind of online platforms, I think if you can take the time, get some resources to learn them, they're really powerful. But I really do think it's the learning curve that keeps some people away or at bay. But a lot of what I do is I do training sessions and I work with new researchers, especially young investigators, to help ramp them up, because I think that I'm at the point in my career where we all rise or fall together. And part of rising is being able to utilize these data sources in a real way to affect change in the world. So yes, I hope that answer your question.
I have one more question, but Ingrid, did you want to add something? Because you came onto camera. I felt like you might have something to add.
Yeah, I just had a thought about that. Stephanie, thank you for that wonderful presentation. We could not be more proud of you, of the work that you're doing, and how you were able to overcome all of these learning curves to be productive. And with regard to learning curves, I want to point out that anybody that wants to do population research and utilize these extant data sets are going to be facing similar steep learning curves. These are complicated data sets and so forth, and it takes some effort. It doesn't come easily. However, with BD Catalyst, I want to just put in a little pre-plug here, is that we're trying to lower all the other nuisance barriers that would make it yet even harder if you were doing it on your own. So
Mm.
we will get into that a little bit more when I give my part of the presentation. But I'm so happy that you had a chance to do this work and so forth. And I did have a quick question. I was wondering, did you consider using the longitudinal data available in MESA to get at the causality issue?
Yeah, and so there have been now a few discrimination papers and we've all tried to use the longitudinal. We did it all. So one of the issues with the way in which MESA collected the data, the CIMT and plaque data was only collected in wave 1 and then again in wave 5. But they were collected by two different, or they were analyzed by two different companies. And so and there were kind of differences. So you kind of have to use either the data in, wave 5 or kind of the data in wave 1 because were some issues there. And so just because of my outcomes, I didn't end up doing that, even though we did some initial analysis and we tried. But I actually think that if you had different outcomes, so like a risk score or something, that you could use the longitudinal data, and it probably would be interesting to look at something like that. But remember, in 2020, we were like going through this crisis of CVD risk scores. So I was like, let's just stay away from that for now. And so now in the machine learning era, we actually have some better ones. So, that is an outcome that I might explore in the future. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. I have one last question for you. And then I will ask you to do a little piece to camera to our Pride scholars out there. And then we'll hand over to Ingrid. So here's the last question. Great presentation. I agree. Great presentation. Pride mentee here. Can you please clarify how you quantified everyday discrimination in your model? Was this information included in the data set? Excellent question.
Yeah. So MESA had everyday discrimination, just like MESA, Jackson Hart, they had everyday discrimination, the David Williams measure. So that's what we used.